The dusty wind carried the scent of wildflowers across the Oklahoma plains, and Beatrice Emmett knew that if she didn't sell every last stem in her basket before sunset, her younger brother would go to bed hungry again. It was the summer of 1887 in Enid, Oklahoma, and the town was little more than a collection of wooden buildings scattered across the flat landscape like dice thrown by an indifferent god. Beatrice knelt in the tall grass just beyond the railroad tracks, her fingers working quickly to gather the purple coneflowers and black-eyed Susans that grew wild in patches, wherever the earth hadn't been trampled completely flat by cattle or horses. Her dress, once a respectable blue calico, had faded to the color of a storm cloud, and the hem was stained permanently brown from the Oklahoma dirt. She was 22 years old, though the worry lines around her eyes might have suggested otherwise to a casual observer. Her basket was nearly full when she heard the whistle of the afternoon train approaching from the east. That meant she had perhaps 2 hours of good selling time before the sun began its descent, and the cowboys and ranchers headed to the saloons instead of walking the main street where she typically stationed herself. She stood, brushing the grass from her skirt, and began the walk back toward town with the basket balanced on her hip. The death of her father 6 months prior had left Beatrice and her 13-year-old brother Thomas in circumstances that could generously be called difficult. Their mother had died giving birth to Thomas, and their father, a ranch hand who drank more than he worked in his final years, had left them nothing but debts and a rented room above the general store that they could no longer afford. Thomas was too young for most ranch work, and Beatrice had discovered quickly that the respectable jobs available to women in Enid, laundress, seamstress, schoolteacher, all required either equipment, skills, or education she didn't possess. So she picked flowers. Every morning before dawn, she walked the prairie surrounding Enid, gathering whatever bloomed. She discovered that cowboys and ranchers, men who spent weeks at a time in the saddle seeing nothing but dust and cattle, would sometimes pay a few cents for flowers to brighten a boarding house room or to give to a lady they were courting. It wasn't much, but on a good day she could make enough to buy bread, beans, and occasionally a bit of salt pork. Today she needed a very good day. The landlord had made it clear that if she didn't have the rent by Friday 2 days away, she and Thomas would be sleeping in the street. Beatrice positioned herself on the wooden walkway in front of the post office, setting her basket down carefully. The flowers looked cheerful and bright, their petals still fresh. She'd learned to pick them at just the right time of morning when the dew kept them from wilting too quickly in the brutal Oklahoma heat. The first hour passed slowly. A few townspeople walked by, nodding politely but not stopping. Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house bought a small bunch of coneflowers for 15 cents, which Beatrice wrapped carefully in a scrap of old newspaper. A ranch hand she didn't recognize bought a single flower for a nickel, grinning sheepishly as he tucked it into his hatband. She was beginning to calculate whether she'd need to stay out past sunset when she noticed the rider. He sat astride a bay horse at the far end of the street, and even from a distance, there was something about the way he carried himself that marked him as different from the usual traffic through Enid. He wore a black hat with a flat brim, and his horse's tack was worked leather that had been oiled until it gleamed. As he rode closer, she could see he was young, perhaps 25 or 26, with a strong jaw and eyes that seemed to take in everything around him with careful attention. He dismounted in front of the saloon, tied his horse, and began walking down the street in her direction. Beatrice straightened her posture and arranged her face into what she hoped was an inviting but not desperate expression. The art of selling flowers, she'd learned, required a delicate balance. The man stopped directly in front of her basket and removed his hat. His hair was dark and slightly too long, curling at his collar. "Good afternoon, miss," he said, and his voice had the distinctive drawl of someone who'd been raised further south, maybe Texas. "Good afternoon, sir," Beatrice replied. "Would you like to buy some flowers today? They're fresh picked this morning." He looked down at the basket for a long moment, then back at her face. His eyes were gray, she noticed, the color of smoke. "How much for the lot?" Beatrice blinked. "I'm sorry." "All of them," he said, gesturing to the basket. "How much would you want for every flower you have?" Her mind raced, trying to calculate. She had perhaps 40 stems in the basket, which she typically sold for 5 to 15 cents each depending on the size and type. On a very good day, she might sell half of them. "That would be $3, sir," she said, picking a number that seemed reasonable but not so high as to scare him away. The man reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a leather wallet. Without hesitation, he extracted $4 and placed them in her palm. "4," he said, "for fresh flowers picked by someone who knows where to find the best ones." Beatrice stared at the coins in her hand. $4 was more than she typically made in a week. It was enough for rent, food, and maybe even a new pair of shoes for Thomas, whose toes were starting to poke through the leather of his only pair. "Thank you," she managed, her voice unsteady. "Thank you so much. I'll wrap them for you right away." "No need," he said. "I don't want them wrapped." She looked up at him, confused. Then, "What would you like me to do with them?" "Keep them," he said simply. "Or sell them again, I don't mind." "I don't understand." He settled his hat back on his head and regarded her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You're out here every day, aren't you? I've seen you the past 3 mornings walking out to the prairie before sunup. You've been watching me." The words came out sharper than she'd intended, edged with alarm. "Not watching," he corrected quickly. "I've been camped north of town, and I'm an early riser. I saw you walking out and wondered what business a young lady had on the prairie that early. This morning I followed at a distance and saw you picking flowers. Seemed like hard work for not much return." Beatrice felt her cheeks flush. She didn't know whether to be grateful or offended. "It's honest work," she said defensively. "Didn't say it wasn't," he replied. "Honest as work gets, but it also seems like there might be better ways for someone with your determination to make a living." "And what would you know about my circumstances?" He held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "Nothing, miss. You're right, and I apologize. I didn't mean to cause offense. I just—" He paused, seeming to search for words. "I just thought maybe you could use a break from walking the prairie at dawn. That's all." Beatrice closed her fingers around the silver dollars. She should probably thank him again and let him go on his way, but curiosity got the better of her. "Why would you pay $4 for flowers you don't even want?" "Because I figure you need it more than I do," he said frankly. "And because I wanted to talk to you without you worrying about whether you'd make enough money today." "Talk to me about what?" He glanced up and down the street, then back at her. "You looking for work? Real work, I mean, not selling flowers." Every instinct told her to be cautious. She'd heard stories about men who offered desperate women work that turned out to be something else entirely. But there was something in his manner that didn't seem predatory. He stood a respectful distance away, made eye contact without leering, and his tone was businesslike rather than familiar. "What kind of work?" she asked carefully. "I'm starting a ranch about 10 miles north of here," he said. "Bought the land 2 months ago, and I'm in the process of building it up. I've got a house that needs keeping, horses that need tending, and eventually I'm hoping to hire enough hands that someone will need to cook for them. Right now it's just me and one hired man, but that'll change soon enough." "You want a housekeeper and a cook, eventually. Someone who can manage the domestic side of things while I handle the cattle and horses." There's a separate cabin on the property that would be yours. Wages would be $30 a month plus room and board. $30 a month. Beatrice's breath caught in her throat. That was more money than her father had made as a ranch hand, and he'd worked himself into an early grave. "Why me?" she asked. "There must be plenty of women in Enid who could do that work." "Because you're already up before dawn and working hard," he said. "Because you know the land well enough to find the best flowers. Because you look like someone who doesn't give up easy. Those are the qualities I need in someone I'm going to trust with my home." It was the most straightforward business proposition Beatrice had ever heard, and yet she hesitated. "I have a brother," she said. "He's 13. I can't leave him alone in town." The man nodded as though he'd expected this. "Bring him. A 13-year-old boy can learn ranch work. I'll teach him myself if he's willing to work hard. He can stay in the cabin with you until he's old enough to bunk with the other hands. You'd hire both of us. Consider it part of your compensation," he said. "Your brother gets training, room, and board. When he's 15, if he wants to sign on as a proper ranch hand, I'll pay him wages too." Beatrice looked down at the flowers in her basket, then back at the man in the black hat. She didn't even know his name, yet he was offering her a way out of the desperate poverty that had defined her life for the past 6 months. It seemed too good to be true, which meant it probably was. "I need to think about it," she said finally. "That's fair," he agreed. "My name is Zachary Irwin. I'll be staying at the boarding house tonight and tomorrow night. You can find me there if you decide you're interested. If not, I wish you the best of luck." He tipped his hat to her and began to walk back toward his horse. Beatrice watched him go, her mind spinning. $30 a month, a cabin, training for Thomas. It could change everything. "Mr. Irwin," she called out before she could stop herself. He turned back. "Yes, miss." "My name is Beatrice Emmett, and I'd like to know more. About the ranch, I mean. About what the work would entail." A smile crossed his face, the first real expression of emotion she'd seen from him. "Would you like to ride out and see it?" "I could take you this afternoon. Have you back in town before dark?" Every cautious bone in her body said no. She didn't know this man. Riding out to an isolated ranch with a stranger was exactly the sort of thing that led to tragedy in the stories women told each other as warnings. But she was so tired. Tired of scraping by, tired of watching Thomas grow thinner, tired of waking up each morning wondering if today would be the day they ended up homeless. And something in Zachary Irwin's steady gray eyes made her want to trust him. "Let me get my brother," she said. "If he comes along, then yes, I'd like to see the ranch." Zachary nodded. "Fair enough. Where should I meet you?" "The general store. We have a room above it. Give me 20 minutes." She gathered her basket and hurried down the street, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and fear. This was either the best decision she'd ever made or the worst, and she wouldn't know which until it was too late to turn back. Thomas was lying on their narrow bed reading a dime novel when she burst through the door. He looked up, startled. "B, what's wrong? Did something happen?" "Get your boots on," she said, setting the basket down. "We're going to look at her ranch." "What? Why?" She told him quickly about Zachary Irwin and his offer while Thomas listened with wide eyes. When she finished, he sat up straight. "You think he's serious? This isn't some kind of trick?" "I don't know," Beatrice admitted. "That's why I want you to come with me. We'll both look at the place, and we'll both decide if it seems legitimate." Thomas swung his legs off the bed and reached for his boots. At 13, he was all gangly limbs and too much energy, with their father's dark hair and their mother's blue eyes. He'd been trying so hard to be grown up since their father died, taking odd jobs when he could find them and never complaining about the meager meals Beatrice managed to scrape together. $30 a month, he said wonderingly as he laced up his boots. "B, that's real money." I know. That's what worries me. Why would anyone offer that much to someone he just met? Maybe he's desperate too, Thomas suggested. Maybe he needs help as bad as we need the money. It was a fair point. Beatrice had been so focused on her own desperation that she hadn't considered Zachary might have his own reasons for making such a generous offer. They met him in front of the general store, 20 minutes later. Zachary had brought his horse and borrowed a wagon from the livery, which Beatrice took as a good sign. At least he'd planned for her brother's presence rather than seeming annoyed by it. "You must be Thomas," Zachary said, offering his hand. "Your sister speaks highly of you." Thomas shook his hand, trying to look older than his years. "I work hard, sir. If you hire us, I'll earn my keep." "I believe it," Zachary said. "Come on, let's head out. I want to get you back before dark like I promised." The ride north took them out of Enid's scattered buildings and into open prairie. The land here rolled in gentle swells, covered in tall grass that rippled like water in the wind. Zachary pointed out landmarks as they went a creek that ran year-round, a stand of cottonwood trees that provided the only significant shade for miles, a rock formation that the local tribes supposedly used as a meeting point. "You know a lot about the area," Beatrice observed from her seat in the wagon. "I've been studying it for 2 years," Zachary said. "I worked as a cattle buyer in Texas, traveling all over, and I kept my eye out for good ranch land that was still affordable. When the land run happened in '89 and this area opened up, I was ready. Saved every penny I could, sold everything I owned, and bought 640 acres. "That's a lot of land," Thomas said, clearly impressed. "It is. Too much for one man to manage alone, which is why I need help. I've got 200 head of cattle arriving next month, and I'm building up a string of horses. Within 2 years, I want to be running 1,000 head. Within 5, I want this to be one of the premier ranches in Oklahoma Territory." There was conviction in his voice, the kind of certainty that came from someone who'd spent a long time planning and dreaming. Beatrice found herself wanting to believe him. They crested a low rise, and Zachary pulled the wagon to a stop. "There," he said, pointing. Below them, in a shallow valley where the unnamed creek ran through a line of trees, sat a house. It was new construction, the wood still golden rather than weathered gray. It was a simple design, 2 stories with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides, but it was substantial and well built. Beyond it stood a barn that looked equally new, and several smaller outbuildings in various stages of completion. The main house has 4 bedrooms upstairs and a parlor, kitchen, and office downstairs, Zachary explained. "The cabin I mentioned is that building there, past the barn. It's got 2 rooms and a stove. Not fancy, but it's solid." Beatrice stared at the little cabin. It was 10 times better than the single room she and Thomas currently shared. "Can we see inside?" "Of course." Zachary drove them down to the ranch and helped Beatrice from the wagon. Up close, the buildings looked even better. The lumber was quality pine, and everything had been constructed with obvious care. The cabin had 2 glass windows, a real door with a lock, and when Zachary opened it, she saw a wood floor instead of packed dirt. "The stove is new," he said, gesturing to the cast iron stove in the corner of the main room. "And I put in a proper chimney so the smoke draws correctly. The bedroom's through there." The bedroom was small but had space for 2 beds and a dresser. Beatrice walked to the window and looked out at the prairie stretching away to the north. She could see for miles from here, could watch the weather rolling in, could breathe air that wasn't thick with the smell of too many people living too close together. "What do you think?" Zachary asked quietly from the doorway. What did she think? She thought it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. She thought she was terrified of hoping it could be real. She thought about Thomas having enough food and a warm place to sleep and the chance to learn a trade. She thought about not having to wake up in the dark to pick flowers anymore. "It's wonderful," she said honestly. "But I need to know, why are you really doing this? You could hire any number of women in Enid. Why offer this to a stranger?" Zachary leaned against the doorframe, his hat in his hands. "You want the truth, please." "I was you," he said simply. "Different circumstances, but the same desperation. When I was 16, my parents died of cholera. I had a younger sister to take care of, and no one wanted to hire a grieving kid with no experience. I got lucky. A rancher outside San Antonio took a chance on me, gave me work and a place to stay. He taught me the cattle business, and when he died, he left me enough money to buy this land. I wouldn't be here if someone hadn't given me a chance when I needed it most." "What happened to your sister?" "She's married now, living in San Antonio with 3 kids. She's happy. But it was close for a while there. I remember what it feels like to not know if you'll eat tomorrow. I remember the fear. And when I saw you walking out to pick flowers before dawn, I recognized that look. Figured I could do for someone else what was done for me." Beatrice turned to face him fully. There was no guile in his expression, no hidden agenda that she could detect, just a man who remembered being desperate and wanted to help. "When would you need us to start?" she asked. His face brightened. "You'll do it, if the terms are what you said, $30 a month, room and board for both of us, and training for Thomas, then yes, we'll do it." "Those are exactly the terms," Zachary confirmed. "And you can start whenever you're ready, tomorrow if you want." Beatrice looked at Thomas, who nodded eagerly. "Tomorrow, then," she said. "We don't have much to pack." They shook hands on it, and Beatrice felt the first flutter of something that might have been hope. The ride back to Enid was filled with Zachary explaining the ranch routine, what her duties would entail, and what Thomas would start learning. By the time they reached town, the sun was setting in a blaze of orange and red across the prairie sky. "I'll come by with the wagon at first light," Zachary said as he helped her down. "Bring whatever you want to keep. Anything you can't carry, we'll come back for later." That night, Beatrice and Thomas packed their few belongings by candlelight. It didn't take long. They owned so little that everything fit into 2 carpet bags and a small trunk. Beatrice looked around the shabby room that had been their home for the past 6 months and felt nothing but relief at leaving it behind. "Are you scared?" Thomas asked as they prepared for bed. "A little," Beatrice admitted, "but I'm more excited than scared. This could be the start of something good, Thomas, a real fresh start." "I hope so," he said quietly. "I hope Mr. Irwin is as good as he seems." "Me too." Zachary arrived just after dawn, as promised. The landlord was less than pleased to see them leaving without paying the back rent. But Beatrice had left the silver dollars Zachary had given her for the flowers, which more than covered what they owed. She walked out of that building with her head high, and her heart lighter than it had been in months. The wagon ride to the ranch felt different in the morning light. The prairie was beautiful in the early sun, golden and green and alive with birdsong. Zachary pointed out plants that were edible, places where antelope liked to graze, and the distant line that marked the boundary of his land. When they arrived at the ranch, another man was working in the corral with a young horse. He was older than Zachary, perhaps 40, with weathered features and capable hands. "That's Dutch Morrison," Zachary said. "My first hire. He's been working cattle since before I was born. Dutch, come meet Beatrice and Thomas Emmett. They're going to be joining us." Dutch climbed down from the corral fence and shook their hands. "Good to meet you both," he said. His voice had a rough edge to it, but his eyes were kind. "Getting mighty tired of Zach's cooking, so if you can do better than burned beans and charred coffee, Miss Emmett, you'll have my eternal gratitude." Beatrice laughed. I think I can manage that. The first few days at the ranch passed in a blur of activity. Beatrice threw herself into organizing the house, which had the bare minimum of furniture and supplies. Zachary gave her money to order what she needed from the general store in Enid, and she carefully cataloged everything the household required: proper cooking utensils, linens, dishes, and food stores. Thomas started learning ranch work under Dutch's patient instruction. Beatrice would watch from the kitchen window as her brother learned to rope, to handle horses, to mend fence. He was getting sunburned and developing calluses, but he looked happier than she'd seen him in months. Zachary himself was harder to read. He was unfailingly polite, respectful of her space, and appreciative of the meals she prepared. But he also kept a certain distance, treating their arrangement as purely business. In the evenings, he'd retreat to his office to work on his books, and Beatrice would return to the cabin with Thomas. 2 weeks after they arrived, Beatrice was baking bread when Zachary came into the kitchen. "Smells good," he said, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. "It'll be ready for supper," she said, wiping flour from her hands. "I'm also making stew with those vegetables from the garden." "About that," Zachary said, "you've done a remarkable job with the garden. When I hired you, I honestly expected it would take months to get the house in proper order, but you've managed it in 2 weeks. "There's still plenty to do," Beatrice said, though she felt pleased at the compliment. "The curtains need hemming, and the upstairs bedrooms need proper furnishing if you're planning to hire more hands." "I am," he confirmed. "Got word today that the cattle are arriving next week. I'll need to hire 3 more men to help manage them." "Which means Dutch's prediction about being tired of my cooking is about to come true in earnest." Beatrice smiled. "I can cook for a crew. My mother used to help in the cookhouse when my father worked at the Big T Ranch. I learned from watching her." "I never doubted it," Zachary said. Then he paused, seeming to struggle with something. "Beatrice, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Are you happy here? I mean, truly. Is this arrangement working for you and Thomas?" She set down the dish towel she'd been holding and looked at him directly. "Mr. Irwin, this is the first time in 6 months that my brother and I have gone to bed with full stomachs and no fear of being thrown out on the street. I wake up in a clean bed in a solid house, and I get to do honest work that I'm good at. Yes, I'm happy here. More than happy." Something in his expression shifted, a tension she hadn't known he was carrying seeming to ease. "I'm glad," he said softly. "I've been worried that maybe I'd asked too much, bringing you out here where it's so isolated." "Isolation is relative," Beatrice said. "I'd rather be here with honest people than in town surrounded by folks who looked right through me when I was selling flowers on the street." "They were fools then," Zachary said. "Anyone who looked through you was missing something remarkable." The words hung in the air between them, carrying a weight that went beyond simple employer praise. Beatrice felt her cheeks warm, and she turned back to the bread dough to hide her reaction. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That's kind of you to say." Zachary cleared his throat. "Well, I should get back to work. Just wanted to check in." After he left, Beatrice stood at the counter with her hands in the bread dough, her heart beating faster than it should. She'd been so focused on the practical aspects of this new life, the work, the security, the future she was building for Thomas, that she hadn't allowed herself to notice Zachary as anything other than an employer. But he was more than that, wasn't he? He was young, handsome in a quiet way, and possessed of a fundamental decency that was rare in Beatrice's experience. The way he treated Thomas, teaching him patiently and never speaking down to him, revealed a kindness that ran deep. The way he'd given her a chance when no one else would. The way he worked from dawn until dusk building his dream. The way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she wasn't paying attention, all of it, added up to something she was afraid to name. She couldn't afford to develop feelings for Zachary Irwin. He was her employer, and she and Thomas depended on him. Risking that security for romantic notions would be the height of foolishness. And yet, the cattle arrived the following Wednesday in a cloud of dust and noise. Beatrice stood on the porch and watched as Zachary and Dutch, along with 3 new hired hands, drove 200 head of longhorns into the holding pens. The men were tired and filthy, and Beatrice had prepared accordingly. She'd spent the past 2 days cooking, and when the men finally straggled to the house, she had beef stew, fresh bread, apple pie, and strong coffee waiting. "Miss Emmett, you're an angel," one of the new hands declared after his second helping of stew. He was a younger man, probably not much older than Beatrice, with red hair and an easy smile. "Best meal I've had since my mama's table." "Don't get used to it, Riley," Dutch said dryly. "This is a working ranch, not a restaurant." "Let the boy appreciate good cooking," Zachary said, though there was amusement in his voice. "Lord knows we've all eaten enough trail dust and hardtack to last a lifetime." The 3 new hands were Riley Cooper, whom Beatrice had already pegged as a charmer, Sam Wells, a quiet man in his 30s with sad eyes, and Pedro Sanchez, who'd come up from Texas and spoke a melodic mix of English and Spanish. They bunked in the barn loft for now, but Zachary was already planning a proper bunkhouse, with 5 men to feed 3 times a day plus maintaining the main house. Beatrice's workload increased substantially. She rose before dawn to start breakfast, spent her mornings cooking and cleaning, her afternoons doing laundry and mending and preparing supper, and her evenings baking bread for the next day. It was exhausting, but it was also satisfying in a way that selling flowers never had been. She was building something here, contributing to something larger than just her own survival. Thomas was thriving. Under Dutch's tutelage, he'd learned to sit a horse properly, to rope a calf, and to read cattle behavior. He was growing stronger, his thin frame filling out with muscle, and the worry that had perpetually creased his young face was beginning to fade. One evening in late August, Beatrice was finishing the dishes when Zachary came into the kitchen. The other men had long since headed to the barn, and Thomas was already asleep in the cabin. "You work too hard," Zachary said without preamble. Beatrice looked up from the pot she was scrubbing. "No harder than anyone else on this ranch." "That's not true." "You're up earlier than any of us and you work later." "When do you rest?" "I rest enough," she said, though in truth she was bone-tired most days. Zachary pulled out a chair and sat at the kitchen table. "I need to hire someone to help you. Another woman, maybe, or a girl from town who wants to learn." "That's not necessary." "Yes, it is. This wasn't what I intended when I hired you. I didn't realize how much work it would be feeding a crew this size, not to mention everything else you do. It's too much for one person." Beatrice set down the pot and dried her hands. "Mr. Irwin, I appreciate your concern, but I can manage. If you hire another woman, you'll have to pay her wages, which means less money for building the ranch. I'd rather see you invest in the operation." "The operation depends on people," Zachary said. "And people can't function if they are exhausted. You're valuable, Beatrice, and I won't have you working yourself to the bone." There was that tone again, the one that suggested his concern went beyond that of an employer worried about a worker's productivity. Beatrice felt something flutter in her chest, a feeling both thrilling and terrifying. "Then I'll train Thomas to help more," she compromised. "He can take over some of the lighter chores, fetching water, gathering eggs if we get chickens, helping with dishes. He's getting strong enough to be useful in the house as well as with the cattle." Zachary considered this. "If Thomas is willing and if it doesn't interfere with his ranch training, then all right. But if I see you wearing yourself down, I'm hiring help regardless of what you say." "Fair enough." He stood to leave, then paused. "Beatrice, I want you to know, you've made this place a home. Before you came, it was just buildings and land. Now it feels like somewhere worth coming back to at the end of the day. I'm grateful for that." Before she could respond, he'd taken his hat and left, leaving her alone in the kitchen with her racing heart and the beginning of something she couldn't quite name. The fall arrived with cooler temperatures and the never-ending work of preparing the ranch for winter. Beatrice spent her days preserving vegetables, putting up preserves, and making sure the household had sufficient supplies to last through the cold months. Zachary made frequent trips to Enid, always returning with supplies and news from town. One October evening, he returned with an unexpected addition, a cow-dog puppy that tumbled out of the wagon in a flurry of black and white fur. "For you," he said to Beatrice, who'd come out to see what the commotion was about. "Every ranch needs a good dog, and I figured you could train this one up from a pup." The puppy immediately began investigating everything, its tail wagging so hard its whole body wiggled. Beatrice knelt down and it bounded over, licking her face enthusiastically. "She's adorable," Beatrice laughed, rubbing the puppy's soft ears. "What's her name?" "Doesn't have one yet. I thought you'd want to choose." Thomas had emerged from the barn to see the puppy, and he immediately dropped to the ground to play with it. The puppy, delighted with this new playmate, jumped all over him. "We should call her Pepper," Thomas said. "Look at all those black spots." "Pepper it is," Beatrice agreed. She looked up at Zachary, who was watching them with a soft expression. "Thank you, this was very thoughtful." "I remember you mentioned your family had a dog when you were young," he said. "You said it was one of your happiest memories." She had mentioned that weeks ago during a dinner conversation. The fact that he'd remembered touched her more than she wanted to admit. That night, after Thomas had gone to sleep with Pepper curled up at the foot of his bed, Beatrice sat on the porch of the cabin watching the stars. The air was cool and clear, carrying the scent of prairie grass and distant rain. She heard footsteps and turned to see Zachary approaching. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. "Of course not." He settled onto the porch step beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. For a moment they sat in comfortable silence. "You miss Enid?" he asked eventually. "Not even a little bit," Beatrice said honestly. "Do you miss Texas?" "Sometimes. I miss my sister and there are friends I left behind. But this place feels right in a way Texas never did. This is mine, you know. Everything I build here is something I chose, something I made happen through my own work. It must be a good feeling." "It is." He paused. "But it's also lonely sometimes. Building something big is harder when there's no one to share it with." Beatrice's heart began to beat faster. "You have the hands, Dutch and the others." "That's not what I mean." The words hung in the night air, heavy with implication. Beatrice knew she should change the subject, should maintain the professional distance that kept this arrangement safe and uncomplicated. But she found she didn't want to. "What do you mean?" she asked softly. Zachary turned to look at her, his gray eyes serious. "I mean that I hired you because you needed help and I could provide it. I told myself it was just good business, just paying forward the kindness someone showed me. But somewhere along the way it became more than that." "Zachary, let me finish," he said gently. "I know this puts you in an awkward position. You work for me, and you and Thomas depend on the security I provide. The last thing I want is for you to feel pressured or uncomfortable. But I also can't keep pretending that I see you only as an employee when the truth is that I think about you constantly. The way you hum when you're cooking, the way you watch the sunrise, the way you've taken care of Thomas and made sure he never feels like a burden. You're the strongest, most capable person I've ever met, and I He trailed off, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "I'm making a mess of this." "No," Beatrice said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're not." She reached out and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. His hand was warm and calloused from ranch work, solid and real. "I've been trying not to feel anything," she admitted. "I told myself it was too risky, that I couldn't afford to jeopardize the life we've built here. But the truth is, I've been failing at that for weeks now. Every time you smile at Thomas, or remember some small thing I said or work until you're exhausted because you believe in this dream so much I can't help but care about you." Zachary squeezed her hand. "So what do we do?" "I don't know," Beatrice said. "This is complicated. Does it have to be?" She thought about that. They were two adults who cared for each other, living on an isolated ranch where the usual social constraints didn't apply. They weren't hurting anyone. Thomas liked and respected Zachary. The work arrangement was succeeding. "Maybe it doesn't," she said finally. "Maybe we can just see what happens. Take it slow." "I can do slow," Zachary said, and the smile that crossed his face made her heart skip. "As long as I know there's a chance." "There's a chance." He raised their joined hands and kissed her knuckles gently. It was the first romantic gesture between them, and it sent warmth flooding through Beatrice's entire body. They sat on the porch until the air grew too cold, talking about their pasts, their hopes and their fears. When Beatrice finally went inside, she felt as though the world had shifted on its axis. Everything looked the same, but somehow everything had changed. The next months passed in a blur of work and slowly developing romance. Zachary was true to his word about taking things slow. There were no dramatic declarations or passionate embraces, just a steady deepening of affection expressed in small ways. He'd bring her wildflowers he found on the range. She'd make his favorite pie without being asked. They'd steal moments together on the porch after everyone else had gone to bed, talking until the stars wheeled overhead. Thomas noticed, of course. One November evening, as he helped Beatrice prepare supper, he said casually, "Zach's sweet on you." Beatrice nearly dropped the knife she was holding. "What? It's obvious," Thomas said, grinning. "He looks at you the way Mr. Henderson looks at his wife when he thinks no one's watching." "Thomas, I think it's good," her brother continued. "Zach's a good man, better than most, and you deserve to be happy, B. You've spent so long taking care of me that you forgot to take care of yourself." Beatrice set down the knife and hugged her brother tightly. "When did you get so wise?" "I've always been wise. You just didn't notice because you were too busy keeping us alive." Winter came to the Oklahoma plains with bitter winds and occasional snow. The cattle huddled together for warmth, and the men took turns riding out to check on them. Beatrice kept the house warm and the meals coming, and in the evenings, the crew would gather in the main room where Dutch played fiddle and Riley sang songs that ranged from bawdy to melancholy. On Christmas Day, Beatrice woke to find that Zachary had strung the main house with pine boughs and filled the kitchen with supplies for a feast. They cooked together that day, just the two of them, while Thomas and the hands did the necessary work outside. "I've never had a Christmas like this," Beatrice said as she rolled out dough for pies. "When I was a child, we were too poor, and last year—" She didn't need to finish. Last year her father had been dead only a month and she and Thomas had huddled in their rented room trying to keep warm. "This is my first real Christmas in years too," Zachary admitted. "When I was working as a cattle buyer, I was usually on the road. This is the first time I've had a home to celebrate in." "It's a good home," Beatrice said softly. "It's perfect now that you're in it." She looked up from the dough and found him watching her with such open affection that it took her breath away. He crossed the kitchen and pulled her gently into his arms, flour-covered hands and all. "I love you, Beatrice Emmett," he said quietly. I know it's only been a few months, and I know this started as a business arrangement, but I'm in love with you. Have been for weeks now." Tears pricked at Beatrice's eyes. "I love you too," she whispered. "I tried not to, but I couldn't help it. You're everything good that I didn't know existed in the world." He kissed her then, sweet and gentle and full of promise. When they broke apart, Beatrice was smiling through her tears. "What do we do now?" she asked. "Well," Zachary said thoughtfully, "I suppose eventually I'd like to marry you if you'll have me, but we don't have to rush. We can take our time, let things develop naturally. As long as I know you'll be here, that's enough." "I'll be here," Beatrice promised. "This is home now." The Christmas feast was a success. Beatrice and Zachary presented roasted beef, mashed potatoes, 3 kinds of pie, and fresh bread. The men ate until they could barely move, and Riley declared it the finest meal of his entire life. After supper, Dutch pulled out his fiddle and they danced in the main room. Pedro taught Beatrice a dance from his childhood in Mexico, and Riley attempted to waltz with Pepper, who was growing rapidly and now came up to his knee. Zachary asked Beatrice to dance, and she went into his arms feeling happier than she could remember. They swayed together to Dutch's fiddle, and she rested her head against his shoulder and thought about how different this Christmas was from the last one. Thomas caught her eye from across the room and gave her a thumbs up, grinning. She smiled back, grateful beyond words that her brother had the chance to grow up here in this place with these good people. Winter gave way to spring, and with it came new calves, new grass, and new plans for expansion. Zachary hired 2 more hands and began construction on the bunkhouse he'd been planning. The ranch was thriving, growing into the vision he'd had when he bought the land. In April, on a warm evening when the prairie was covered in wildflowers, Zachary asked Beatrice to take a walk with him. They strolled along the creek, Pepper bounding ahead of them chasing grasshoppers. "You remember the day we met?" Zachary asked. "Of course. You bought all my flowers and told me to keep them. Do you remember what you were selling? Black-eyed Susans and purple coneflowers mostly. And do you remember why I really bought them?" Beatrice smiled. "Because you wanted an excuse to talk to me." "Yes," he agreed. "But also because I thought you looked like you belonged here. In the open, with flowers growing around you, not trapped in town trying to sell beauty to people who couldn't see it." He stopped walking and turned to face her. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of gold and pink, and the prairie stretched away in all directions, vast and free. "I've watched you bloom here," he said. "Like those flowers you used to pick. You've grown into yourself, into your strength and capability and joy. And I want to spend the rest of my life giving you the space and safety to keep blooming." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Inside was a simple gold ring with a small diamond that caught the evening light. "Beatrice Emmett, will you marry me? Will you be my partner in building this ranch and this life? Will you let me love you for the rest of my days?" Beatrice felt tears streaming down her face, but they were happy tears. "Yes," she said. "Yes, absolutely yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger and kissed her deeply, his arms tight around her. Pepper barked excitedly, running circles around them, and in the distance, Beatrice could hear the cattle lowing and the sound of the men working in the corrals. This was home. This was love. This was the life she'd never dared dream of when she was picking flowers at dawn to survive. They married in June, in a simple ceremony at the small church in Enid. Thomas stood up as witness, beaming with pride. Dutch and the ranch hands attended, along with a few townspeople who'd gotten to know Beatrice through her supply trips to town. Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house, who'd been one of the few people to treat Beatrice kindly when she was selling flowers, clasped her hands after the ceremony. "I knew you'd make something of yourself, dear," she said. You had that look about you like you wouldn't quit no matter what. The wedding supper was held at the ranch, with tables set up outside under the stars. Dutch played his fiddle and Riley sang, and Beatrice danced with her husband until her feet hurt. She'd never been happier. That night, Zachary carried her across the threshold of the main house, which was now officially her home. Her things had been moved from the cabin, and the bedroom they'd share was warm and welcoming. "Thank you," she whispered as they lay together in the darkness. "For what?" "For seeing me that day. For taking a chance on a desperate woman selling flowers. For giving me and Thomas a life." Zachary pulled her close. "You gave me just as much. You made this house a home. You made me believe in something beyond just building a successful ranch. You made me understand what I was really working for." "What's that?" "A future," he said simply. "A future with you." The years that followed were full of hard work, joy, and growth. The ranch expanded steadily under Zachary's careful management. Within 3 years, they were running 1,000 head of cattle and had become known throughout Oklahoma Territory for quality stock. Thomas grew into a fine young man, and at 18, he signed on as a full ranch hand with proper wages. He was skilled with horses and cattle, respected by the other hands, and Zachary had begun teaching him the business side of ranching with an eye toward eventually making him a partner. Beatrice continued to manage the domestic side of the ranch, but with Zachary's insistence, they'd hired a young woman named Sarah from town to help with the cooking and cleaning. This freed Beatrice to focus on other aspects of ranch life. She developed an interest in breeding horses and had successfully raised several colts that sold for excellent prices. In the spring of 1890, Beatrice discovered she was pregnant. She told Zachary one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, the same porch where he'd first told her he loved her. "We're going to have a baby," she said, taking his hand and placing it on her still flat stomach. The look of wonder and joy on his face was something she'd treasure forever. "A baby," he repeated. "We're going to be parents. Are you happy?" "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," he said, pulling her into his arms. "You've given me everything, Beatrice. Everything I ever wanted, and things I didn't even know to want." Their son was born in December, during the first snowfall of the season. He came into the world squalling and healthy, with his father's gray eyes and his mother's dark hair. They named him Daniel, after Zachary's father. Holding her son for the first time, Beatrice thought back to that desperate morning when she'd been picking flowers to sell, not knowing if she'd make enough to keep a roof over their heads. She thought about how close she and Thomas had come to complete destitution, and how one man's kindness had changed everything. "What are you thinking about?" Zachary asked softly. He sat beside the bed, looking exhausted and elated in equal measure. "About flowers," Beatrice said. "About how I used to pick them before dawn, desperate and afraid, and about how you bought them all and asked me to stay." "Best decision I ever made," Zachary said, reaching out to stroke his son's soft cheek. "For me too," Beatrice agreed. "For me too." Life settled into a happy rhythm. Daniel was a healthy, cheerful baby who charmed everyone on the ranch. Dutch whittled him toys, and Riley taught him nonsense songs as soon as he could babble. Thomas was a devoted uncle, often taking Daniel on gentle rides around the ranch in front of his saddle. The ranch continued to prosper. By 1893, they'd expanded to 2,000 acres and ran 1,500 head of cattle. The bunkhouse had been completed and housed 8 full-time hands. Zachary had built Beatrice a proper garden with a fence to keep out the deer, and she grew vegetables and flowers in equal measure. They had 2 more children in the years that followed, a daughter named Lily in 1892 and another son, James, in 1895. The main house rang with children's laughter, and Beatrice often found herself stopping in the middle of her work to simply marvel at how full her life had become. Thomas married Sarah, the young woman who'd been hired to help Beatrice in the kitchen, and Zachary built them a house on the far side of the ranch property. They had their first child, a daughter, in 1894, making Beatrice an aunt and Zachary an honorary one. One evening in the summer of 1896, Beatrice and Zachary sat on the porch as they so often did. The children were asleep inside, and the ranch was quiet except for the sounds of cattle and horses in the distance. "You ever think about that day?" Zachary asked. "The day we met?" "All the time," Beatrice admitted. "I think about how desperate I was, how afraid, how I had no idea that my entire life was about to change. I think about how close I came to not stopping," Zachary said. "I'd ridden past you the previous 2 mornings, telling myself it wasn't my business. But that third morning, something made me follow you. Something told me I had to at least talk to you." "Fate," Beatrice suggested. "Maybe. Or maybe just recognizing something in you that I'd once seen in myself, that determination to survive no matter what." Beatrice reached over and took his hand as she had countless times over the years. "We've built something beautiful here," she said. "Not just the ranch, but the life, the family, everything." "We have," Zachary agreed, "and it all started with flowers." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. In the distance, a coyote howled, and from the barn came the gentle nickering of horses settling for the night. Inside the house, their children slept safely. Across the ranch, Thomas and Sarah were likely putting their own daughter to bed. The hands were in the bunkhouse, probably playing cards or reading by lamplight. Everything Zachary had dreamed of when he bought this land had come true and more. "I love you," Beatrice said softly. "More than I could ever properly say." "I love you too," Zachary replied. "Thank you for taking a chance on me. Thank you for staying. Thank you for asking me to." The years continued to pass in a blur of seasons and growing children. Daniel grew tall and serious, fascinated by the business side of ranching. Lily was wild and fearless, constantly climbing things she shouldn't and bringing home injured animals to nurse back to health. James was quiet and thoughtful, spending hours watching the horses and drawing pictures of them in a battered notebook. The ranch continued to thrive under Zachary's management and Thomas's capable assistance. They weathered droughts and harsh winters, good markets and bad, but the foundation Zachary had built was solid enough to withstand it all. In 1901, when Beatrice was 36 years old and Zachary 39, they stood together at the fence line looking out over their land. Daniel was 15 now, already talking about the agricultural college in Stillwater. Lily was 9, and had just successfully ridden her first calf in an impromptu rodeo that had given Beatrice a heart attack. James was 6, and had presented her with a remarkably good sketch of Pepper, now an elderly dog who spent most of her time sleeping in sunny spots. "We should expand the horse operation," Zachary said, in the tone of someone continuing an ongoing conversation. "Daniel's interested in the business side, but I think James has the eye for breeding. And Lily, well, Lily's going to be the best horsewoman in Oklahoma Territory if she doesn't break her neck first." Beatrice laughed. "She's fearless. I don't know where she gets it." "From you," Zachary said immediately. "She gets it from you. You're the bravest person I know." "I'm not brave, I was just desperate." "No," Zachary said firmly. "Desperation was part of it, but you were also brave. You took a risk coming out here with a stranger. You trusted me when you had no reason to. You built a life from nothing. That's courage, Beatrice." She leaned against him, and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders. They stood like that for a long time, watching the sun set over the land they'd built together. In 1905, Daniel left for college, the first member of either family to pursue higher education. Beatrice cried as they put him on the train, even though he promised to come home for holidays. Zachary reminded her gently that this was what they'd worked for to give their children opportunities and choices. Lily, at 13, was already talking about starting her own horse training business. James, at 10, had filled 3 notebooks with sketches and was learning to break horses with a gentleness that produced remarkably calm, well-trained animals. Thomas and Sarah's family had grown to include 3 children, and Thomas had become a full partner in the ranch operation. The land had expanded to 3,000 acres, and they ran 2,000 head of cattle and bred horses that were in demand across the territory. One autumn evening in 1907, the whole family gathered for supper at the main house. Daniel was home from college for a visit, full of ideas about modern ranching techniques. Lily was arguing passionately for expanding the horse breeding program. James was showing Thomas his latest drawings. Sarah was helping Beatrice serve supper while their children ran around outside in the last light of day. Beatrice looked around the crowded, noisy table and felt her heart swell with gratitude. All of this had grown from that desperate morning when she'd picked flowers to sell. From Zachary's kindness in buying them all. From his simple question, "Would you like to stay?" After supper, after the dishes were washed and the children were in bed, Beatrice and Zachary took their usual evening walk. It was something they'd done for 20 years now, a way to reconnect after the busy day and simply be together. "You remember the flowers I bought from you?" Zachary asked. "That very first day, of course. Black-eyed Susans and purple coneflowers. I've been thinking," he said. "We should plant them, all around the house. A whole garden of them so you never have to go pick them at dawn again." Beatrice stopped walking and looked up at him. After 20 years of marriage, he could still surprise her. "That would be beautiful." "You deserve beautiful things," Zachary said simply. "You always have. I'm just glad I've gotten to spend these years giving them to you." "You've given me everything," Beatrice said. "A home, a family, a purpose, security, love. Things I never thought I'd have." "We gave those things to each other," Zachary corrected. "I was just a lonely man with a dream before you came. You made it all real. You made it matter." They stood together under the stars, the same stars that had witnessed their first kiss, their wedding, the births of their children, and all the quiet moments of contentment in between. The years continued their steady march forward. Daniel graduated from college and returned to the ranch with a degree in agricultural business, and a sweet young woman named Catherine, whom he married in 1909. They moved into a new house built on the eastern section of the ranch and began their own family. Lily, true to her word, started a horse training business that quickly gained a reputation for producing the finest working horses in Oklahoma. She married a cowboy named Jack Riley in 1912, and they built a house near the breaking pens where she could always be close to the horses she loved. James combined his artistic eye with his skill at breeding horses and developed a line of paint horses known for their distinctive markings and gentle temperaments. He married his childhood sweetheart, Anne, in 1915, and they settled in a house near the main ranch buildings. Thomas and Sarah's children grew and built their own lives, some staying on the ranch and some venturing out to other opportunities. The ranch itself had become something of a family compound, with multiple houses scattered across the property and 3 generations working the land together. In 1917, as America entered the Great War, Daniel and several of the younger ranch hands enlisted. Beatrice spent those years in a state of constant worry, praying every night for their safe return. When Daniel came home in 1919, thinner and quieter but whole, she wept with relief. The 1920s brought new challenges and new prosperity. The ranch adapted to modern techniques. They bought their first truck in 1921, installed telephone lines in 1923, and began using tractors for certain operations in 1925. But the core of the operation remained the same: quality cattle and horses, managed by people who cared about the land and each other. In 1927, Beatrice and Zachary celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary. Their children and grandchildren organized a huge celebration, with the entire ranch gathering for a barbecue and dance. Dutch, now in his 80s, brought out his fiddle one more time and played the same songs he'd played at their wedding. As Beatrice danced with her husband under strings of lights hung between the trees, she thought about the journey they'd taken together. From that desperate morning selling flowers to this moment, surrounded by the family and life they'd built, it was more than she'd ever dreamed possible. Happy? Zachary asked, his arms around her as they swayed to the music. Happier than I have words for, Beatrice replied. Good, that's all I ever wanted, to make you happy. You did that the day you bought all my flowers and asked me to stay. The years grew shorter, as they always do when life is full and good. The ranch continued to thrive under the combined management of Zachary, Thomas, and now Daniel. The grandchildren grew into capable young adults, and great-grandchildren began to arrive, adding new life and laughter to the family gatherings. In 1935, Dutch Morrison passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 91. He'd spent 46 years on the Irwin Ranch, and his funeral was attended by more than 200 people whose lives he'd touched. They buried him on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a view of the land he'd helped build. Thomas retired in 1938, turning over his partnership share to his oldest son. He and Sarah moved to a smaller house in Enid, though they visited the ranch frequently and never missed a family gathering. In 1940, Beatrice and Zachary stood together in the flower garden he'd planted for her years ago. Black-eyed Susans and purple coneflowers grew in profusion, along with dozens of other varieties. It had become her sanctuary, a place where she could sit and think and remember. 75 years old, Zachary said, shaking his head. How did that happen? One day at a time, Beatrice replied. One day at a time lived well. They were both showing their age now. Zachary's dark hair had gone completely silver, and he moved a little slower than he once had. Beatrice's hands were gnarled with arthritis, and she tired more easily. But their minds were sharp, and their love for each other had only deepened with time. That summer, the ranch celebrated its 50th anniversary. 4 generations of family gathered, along with friends and neighbors and former ranch hands who'd worked there over the years. There were speeches and reminiscences, stories and laughter. Daniel stood up to speak, looking distinguished at 55 with gray streaking his temples. My parents built something extraordinary here, he said. Not just a successful ranch, though it's certainly that. But more importantly, they built a family and a way of life founded on hard work, kindness, and taking care of each other. My father saw someone who needed help, and instead of looking away, he offered her a chance. My mother took that chance and made it into something beautiful. Everything we have, everything we are, grew from that moment. Beatrice listened with tears in her eyes, Zachary's hand tight in hers. That night, after everyone had left and the ranch was quiet again, they sat together on the porch. It was the same porch where Zachary had first told her he loved her, where he'd proposed, where they'd sat countless evenings watching their children play and their grandchildren grow. Do you have any regrets? Zachary asked quietly. Beatrice thought about it, really considered it. They'd had hard times along with the good years when money was tight, seasons when they lost cattle to disease or drought, the worry and fear during the wars. But through it all, they'd had each other. "No," she said finally. "No regrets, not a single one. Everything we've been through brought us here to this moment, to this life. I wouldn't change any of it, not even the desperate morning picking flowers." "Especially not that," Beatrice said firmly, "because that's the morning that led me to you." Zachary raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently, the same gesture he'd made the first night they'd acknowledged their feelings for each other. "I love you, Beatrice Irwin. I have loved you for more than 50 years, and I'll love you for whatever time we have left." "I love you too," she whispered. "Thank you for buying all my flowers. Thank you for asking me to stay. Thank you for this beautiful life." They sat together under the stars, two people who'd started with nothing but hope and determination, and had built something that would last for generations. The ranch stretched out around them in the darkness, full of the lives they'd touched and the legacy they'd created. And in the flower garden, black-eyed Susans and purple coneflowers swayed gently in the night breeze, a reminder of how it all began with a desperate woman selling flowers for survival, and a kind man who bought them all and changed both their lives forever. The story could end there, with that perfect moment of reflection and gratitude. But life continued its forward march, bringing both joy and sorrow as it always does. Zachary passed away in his sleep in 1943, at the age of 81. He'd been working on ranch business the day before, his mind sharp until the very end. Beatrice held his hand as he took his last breath, whispering her love and gratitude for the 56 years they'd shared. The grief was profound, but Beatrice took comfort in the life they'd built together. She was surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren who all carried pieces of Zachary in their faces, their mannerisms, their values. He lived on in every acre of the ranch, in every business decision guided by his principles of fairness and hard work. Beatrice lived another 12 years, remaining sharp and engaged with ranch life until the very end. She spent her days in the flower garden, playing with great-grandchildren, and telling stories about the old days to anyone who would listen. She never tired of telling how she and Zachary had met, how he'd bought all her flowers and asked her to stay. "It wasn't just a business arrangement," she'd say to her grandchildren. "It was fate. It was two people who needed each other finding each other at exactly the right moment." That's what love is, not just romance, but partnership, building something together that's bigger than either person could create alone. Beatrice Irwin passed away peacefully in 1955 at the age of 90, surrounded by her family. They buried her next to Zachary on the hill overlooking the ranch, with a view of the flower garden she'd loved so much. Her children ensured that black-eyed Susans and purple coneflowers were always blooming there, a living memorial to the woman who'd picked them for survival and ended up cultivating an entire legacy. The ranch continued to thrive, passed down through the generations, each one adding their own chapter to the story while honoring the foundation that Beatrice and Zachary had built. The original house still stood, carefully maintained, with photos of the founders displayed prominently in every room. And every summer, the family gathered for a reunion, sharing food and stories and memories. The newest generation would hear about their great-great-grandmother who sold flowers on the street, and their great-great-grandfather who'd bought them all and offered her a life. They'd learn about courage and kindness, about taking chances and working hard, about building something that would last. The story of Beatrice and Zachary became part of family legend, told and retold until it took on an almost mythical quality. But at its heart, it remained a simple truth. Sometimes, in our darkest moments, someone extends a hand, and sometimes we're brave enough to take it. And from that single moment of connection, entire lives can bloom, lives filled with love, purpose, and a legacy that echoes through generations. The Oklahoma prairie still rolled out in gentle swells, covered in tall grass that rippled like water in the wind. And in one corner of that vast landscape, on a hill overlooking a thriving ranch, two headstones stood side by side, their inscriptions simple: Zachary Irwin, 1862, 1943, beloved husband, father, and friend; Beatrice Emmett Irwin, 1865–1955, beloved wife, mother, and heart of our home. And all around them, wild and cultivated in equal measure, black-eyed Susans and purple coneflowers bloomed eternal, a testament to where it all began, with flowers, with kindness, with love, and with a simple question that changed everything. Would you like to stay?